Chapter 1. A New Start. Mr. Duncan? Come in, please. Mr. Wilson will see you now. Thank you. John Duncan stood up and walked nervously towards the door. He was a tall, thin man, about 45 years old, in an old gray suit. It was his best suit, but it was 10 years old now. He had gray hair and glasses. His face looked sad and tired. Inside the room, a man stood up to welcome him. Mr. Duncan, pleased to meet you. My name's David Wilson. This is one of our chemists, Mary Carter. John Duncan shook hands with both of them and sat down. It was a big office with a thick carpet on the floor and beautiful pictures on the walls. David Wilson was a young man in an expensive black suit. He had a big gold ring on one finger. He smiled at John. I asked Miss Carter to come because she's one of our best chemists. She discovered our wonderful new paint, in fact. If you come to work here, you will work with her. Oh, I see. John looked at Mary. She was older than Wilson, about 35 perhaps, with short brown hair and a pretty friendly face. She was wearing a white coat with a lot of pens in the top pocket. She smiled at him kindly, but John felt miserable. I'll never get this job, he thought. I'm too old. Employers want younger people these days. David Wilson was looking at some papers. Now, Mr. Duncan, he said, I see that you are a very good biologist. You worked at a university, and then for 2 very famous U.S. companies. But you stopped working as a biologist 9 years ago. Why was that? I've always had 2 interests in my life, John said. Biology and boats. My wife was a famous sailor, Rachel Horsley. Perhaps you remember her. She sailed around the world alone in a small boat. Yes, said David Wilson. I remember her. So we started a business, said John. We made small boats together and sold them. And did the business go well? Asked Wilson. Very well at first. Then we wanted to build bigger belter boats. We borrowed too much money. And then my wife... John stopped speaking. Yes, the Sevens race. I remember now, said David Wilson. Both men were silent for a moment. Wilson remembered the newspaper reports of the storm and the lives lost at sea. He looked at the man who sat sadly in front of him. So, after my wife died, continued John, I closed the business. That was 5 years ago. I see, said David Wilson. It's a hard world, the world of business. He looked at John's old gray suit. So now you want a job as a biologist. Well, this is a chemical company, Mr. Duncan. We make paint, but we need a biologist to make sure that everything in this factory is safe. We want someone to tell the government that it's safe to work here, and that it's safe to have a paint factory near the town. That's important to us. And if something's not safe, then of course we'll change it, Mary Carter said. David Wilson looked at her, but he didn't say anything. Yes, I see. John began nervously. Well, I think I could do that. I mean, when I worked for Harper Chemicals in London, He talked for 2 or 3 minutes about his work. David Wilson listened, but he didn't say anything. Then he smiled. It was a cold, hard smile, and it made John feel uncomfortable. He remembered his old suit and gray hair, and he wished he hadn't come. You really need this job, don't you, Mr. Duncan? David Wilson said. You need it a lot. Yes, I do, he said quietly. But he thought, I hate you, Wilson. You're enjoying this. You like making people feel small. I hate people like you. Wilson's smile grew bigger. He stood up and held out his hand. Okay, he said. When can you start? What? John was very surprised. What did you say? I said, when can you start, Mr. Duncan? We need you in our factory as soon as possible. Will Monday be okay? You mean I've got the job? Of course. Congratulations. Wilson shook John's hand. My secretary will tell you about your pay. You'll have your own office and a company car, of course. I'd like you to start work with Mary on Monday. Is that okay? Yes, of course, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much. Chapter 2. At Home. Hi, Dad. Your supper's in the kitchen. John's 16-year-old daughter, Christine, was sitting at the table doing her homework. His son, Andrew, who was 13, was watching television. Thanks, Christine, John said. I'm sorry I'm late. Is everything okay? Fine, thanks. Christine gave him a quick smile, then go with her work. John got his food from the kitchen, fried fish and chips. The food was dry and didn't taste very good. But he didn't say anything about that. John was not a good cook himself, and his children were no better. His wife had been a good cook, he remembered. John tried to eat the terrible supper and looked around the small, miserable flat. The furniture was 20 years old. The wallpaper and carpets were cheap and dirty. The rooms were all small, and he could see no trees or gardens from the windows, just the lights from hundreds of other flats. And there were hooks, clothes, and newspapers on the floor. Once, when his wife had been alive, he had had a fine house. A beautiful big house in the country, with a large garden. They had had lots of new furniture, 2 cars, pensive holidays, everything they needed. He had to have a good job. They hadn't needed to think about money. And then he had started the boat building company, and his look had ended. When Rachel had died, John had been terribly unhappy. Much too unhappy to think about business. A few months later, his company had closed, and he had lost all his money. John had had to sell his beautiful house in the country and move to this miserable flat. And for the last 2 years, he hadn't had a job at all. He was a poor man, and an unlucky one too. He had tried for lots of jobs and got none of them. There were too many bright young biologists. But now that was all going to change. He looked at his daughter and smiled. Did you have a good day at school, Christine? He asked her. Oh, all tight, I suppose, she said. She didn't look very happy. I've got a letter for you. She pushed the letter across the table, and he opened it. It was from her school. One of the teachers was taking the children on a skiing holiday to the mountains in Switzerland. It cost £400 for 10 days. Parents who wanted their children to go had to send the money to the school before February 25th. John's smile grew bigger. Do you want to go on this holiday, Christine? He asked. She looked at him strangely. Of course I do, Dad, she said. But I can't, can I? We haven't got £400. No, I suppose not. He looked at her carefully through his thick glasses. She was a clever, strong girl, good at her schoolwork, good at sports. But she had never been skiing. John hadn't had enough money. "Are your friends going?" he asked her. "Some of them, yes. Miranda, Jane, Nigel, the rich ones, you know. But they often go skiing. It's easy for them." "I know I can't go, Dad." "Throw the letter away." John looked at her and felt his heart beating quickly. "No, don't do that, Christine," he said. "Perhaps you can go if you want to. Why not?" Christine laughed. "What's happened, Dad? Have you robbed a bank or something?" John stood up. He went into the kitchen and got himself a drink. "No," he said when he came back. "But something interesting happened today. Put your homework away, Christine, and turn that TV off, Andrew. I've got something to tell you." "Oh, not now, Dad," said Andrew. "This is an exciting story." John smiled. "I've got an exciting story too, Andrew. Come and listen." John Duncan's children lived in an old, untidy flat. They had no money, and they often ate awful food. But they could still talk to their father. So Andrew turned off the TV and sat down in a big armchair beside his father and Christine. The story didn't sound very exciting at first. "I went to a factory today," John said. "That paint factory by the river." "No, wait, Andrew. Paint factories can be very exciting. They gave me a job there. I'm going to have my own office, a big cat, lots of money. In fact, we're going to be rich." Chapter 3. Rich man John Duncan started work on Monday, and Mary Carter showed him round the factory. The most important thing that the company produced was a new paint for cars. It was a very strong, hard paint, which nothing could damage. Mary and her chemists had developed it, and they had tested it all over the world. Neither acid nor salt water could damage it, and cars came back from both the Arctic and the Sahara looking like new. The company was beginning to make a lot of money from this paint, and it had brought 400 new jobs to the town. One day, when he was working with the paint, John spilt some of the waste products on his leg. He cleaned it off quickly, but it left a red, painful place on his skin, which would not go away. It kept him awake at night. He told his doctor what he had spilt on it, and the doctor looked at him strangely. "So these chemicals had something to do with the new paint, did they?" the doctor asked carefully. "Yes, I told you. It was a bottle of the waste products. I was looking at them in my office." "I see." The doctor looked out of the window thoughtfully. His fingers moved quietly on his desk. "And your company is producing a lot of these waste products now, I suppose?" "Yes, of course." John was in a hurry. He had to meet someone important in 10 minutes. "Look, can you give the something to put on it or not?" "Oh, yes." The doctor began to write something on a piece of paper. "Put this on night and morning and the pain will go in a day or two. But I'm afraid the skin there will stay red for a year or two. They're nasty chemicals, Mr. Duncan, you know." "Yes, I know." John smiled at him. "But don't worry, doctor. We're very careful with them in the factory. No one can go near them without special safe clothing. You can come and see if you like." "I'm very pleased to hear it," said the doctor. He gave the piece of paper to John. "Thank you," said John. He went towards the door. "Mr. Duncan?" "Yes?" John looked back, surprised. "Where do these waste products go when the factory has finished with them? Into the river?" "Well, yes, of course," said John. "But it's all right, you know." In added quickly, "It's very carefully checked all the time. It's a big river, and we only produce a few hundred liters of the waste products a day. And we're only 2 kilometers from the sea, after all." "Good," said the doctor. "I wouldn't want anyone to drink those waste products, that's all." "They won't, doctor," said John. "All the drinking water comes out of the river 5 kilometers upstream. You know that. Who's going to drink salt water from the river mouth lot, heaven's sake? Chemists from London have checked it, you know? And our company lawyers know all about it. So it's not dangerous and we're not doing anything wrong. Don't worry about it." He went out of the door, and after half an hour he had forgotten the conversation. He was a very busy man now. All day he had to test different types of paints and make sure they were safe. He was also busy buying a big, comfortable house for his family, with a large field beside it, where Christine could keep a horse. The house was 1/2 kilometer from the sea, and its gardens went down to the river. There was an empty boathouse there. "Can we have a boat, Dad?" Andrew asked. "I mean, not now, of course, but one day, when you finished paying for the house, perhaps." John laughed. His children had been poor for so long, but now he could buy them anything they wanted. "You can have a boat now if you want, my son," he said happily. "If I can afford a big house like this, I can certainly afford a small boat. We'll go fishing every week, shall we? And I'll teach you both to sail in the evenings. I've always wanted to do that, you know." He could not believe how lucky he was. He had a good job at last, a fine home, and his children had everything they wanted. He only wished his wife, Rachel, was alive to enjoy it with him. There was only one thing that he could not give his children now. He could not give them back their mother. Chapter 4. The Seals. A few months later, John invited Mary to a meal in the new house. It was a difficult evening. He had never invited anyone to their old flat, and the children's friends never came for meals. The new house was very untidy, and John was nervous about the food. He and Christine cooked a chicken because they thought it was easy. But the chicken was tasteless and the rice was too soft. Mary smiled and pretended not to notice. But the evening went badly. Christine was angry with her because she tidied up the kitchen, and Andrew was angry with her because she didn't want to watch TV. Both the children went to bed early and thought about their mother. But Mary came again on a Sunday, and John took them an all-hour in their new boat. That was much better. Mary didn't know how to sail, so the children had to tell her what to do. She did what she was told and seemed to be happy. John sat at the back of the boat and watched his children quietly. He felt proud of them, and he thought we're proud of him too. The first time Mary and the children laughed together, John felt a big smile come onto his face. It was a beautiful, sunny day in the middle of May. There was a good wind, and the sailing was fun. The boat sailed fast, over small white-topped waves. The sky was blue and clear. They sailed down to the mouth of the river, where there were lots of small islands and sandbanks. "Look, Dad, quick, over there. What are they? Andrew pointed excitedly to one of the long, low sandbanks. Seals, said Joint. Haven't you seen them before? No, said Andrew. Only in films, not in real life. His face was shining, excited, happy. Do they really live here? Yes. It's a group of seal families. The mothers come here every year to have their babies. They sailed closer to the sandbank until they were only about 20 meters away from the seals. Wet, shiny seal mothers lifted their heads and looked at them with their blue eyes. The baby seals were drinking milk from their mothers, climbing over them, and playing in the shallow water. Then a big father seal lifted his head and stared angrily at them. I think they're beautiful, said Mary. I never knew they lived here so close to the town. It makes me feel really happy just to see them. Yes, it does, doesn't it? Said Christine. I think nothing can be really wrong with the world if they can live here, all by themselves, with no one looking after them. Yes, said Mary, and they're really beautiful too. Look, did you see that little one playing on his mother's back? I wish I could do that. John smiled as he watched Mary and his children laughing and talking together. He thought the world was a good place. 2. Chapter 5. The New Experiment. A few days later, John asked Mary to look at another experiment. He took her into a long, quiet room at the back of the factory. The room was full of the noises of small animals. I've been testing the waste products, he said. Here, look at this. He gave her a sheet of paper. Some of these rats have had the waste products in their food and drinking water. There's no real problem yet. 1 or 2 have become ill, but not many. There's nothing very serious. Mary read the results carefully. She didn't like this kind of experiment, but she knew it was necessary. And John was right. No rats had died, and not very many were ill. So what do you want to show me? She asked. This, he said. He opened a box by the window. These 10 rats have had the waste products in their drinking water for 2 weeks now. I gave them a lot, 5 parts per million. They're going to have babies today. If the babies are okay, we've got nothing to worry about. Oh, John, she said, what an awful thing to do. I know, he said, but he wasn't listening. Look, he said excitedly, some of them have been born already. He lifted some of the baby rats out of the box and looked at them through a magnifying glass. Oh dear, he said at last, sadly. Perhaps there is a problem. Look. Mary looked through the magnifying glass. She began so feel ill. There was a long silence. There certainly is a problem. Mary's voice sounded loud and high in the courtroom. She stared at the small animals under the magnifying glass. Baby rats with no eyes, no care, 6 legs. Oh, John, what have you done? He looked at her strangely. It's awful, isn't it? Rut, I had to know. And remember, Mary, their mothers have had 5 parts per million of these chemicals in their drinking water for 2 weeks. That's a lot. Much, much more than we're putting in the river. Mary looked away from the rats. She remembered the beautiful afternoon that they had spent with John's children, sailing on the dear blue water. John, These waste products are dangerous, she said. We've got to stop putting them in the river. Of course, of course. John put his hand on her arm. But it was the same hand, the hand that had held the rats. Of course we'll stop it if we need to, Mary. The company can build machines to clean the waste products. I'll start my report for David Wilson next week. But she turned round to face him. His hand fell from her arm. Don't you think we should stop making the paint now, John? Perhaps it'll take years to build those machines, and we're putting the chemicals into the river right now. A shadow crossed his face. His eyes looked at hers. They away, out of the window. I don't think we need to do that now, Mary. We're putting very little into the river at the moment, and the company will build those machines, won't they? She remembered her long years of work, the hundreds of unsuccessful experiments. She touched his hand and smiled. I hope so, John, she said. I really hope so. She turned and went quickly out of the room. Chapter 6. John's report took longer than he had thought. It was nearly 6 weeks later when he went to discuss the results with David Wilson. Mr. Wilson wasn't a scientist. He was a businessman. He knew how to run a business, how to make money. Thanks for coming, John. David Wilson came out from behind his desk and shook hands with John. They sat in 2 big, comfortable armchairs by the window. David Wilson's office was large, with a thick carpet and beautiful pictures on the walls. From the window, John could see the river and the woods and fields on the other side. He felt comfortable, happy, safe. I've read your report, Wilson began. Then he stopped and lit a cigarette. Not very good, is it? What? John stared at him in surprise. Wilson smiled and moved his hand through the clouds of smoke. No, don't worry. I don't mean the report is bad, of course not. You've worked very hard and done your job well. What I mean is, I don't like the ideas at the end of the report. What's wrong with them? They're too expensive. The 2 men stared at each other for a moment, and John felt cold and sick in his stomach. Wilson smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that John liked. Look, John, he said, your report says that we should build some new machines to clean up the waste products before they go into the river, right? And those machines will cost £2 million. Where do you think we can find all that? Money doesn't grow on trees, you know. No, of course not. John's mouth was dry. He took a drink of water and felt his hand shaking. But we're selling a lot of the new paint. We're making millions of pounds every month from that, aren't we? We're doing very well, yes, said Wilson. But if we spend £2 million to build these new machines, the paint will have to cost more, and we won't sell so much. But we've got to do it, said John. These waste products are much more dangerous than I'd thought. Didn't you read that in my report? When I put the chemicals in rats' drinking water, some of the baby rats were born without eyes and ears. One didn't have any legs, and one had 6. He shivered. And some were born without legs when they drank only 2 parts per million. We can't put those chemicals in the river. Of course I read that, John. I read your report very carefully indeed. And your report also says that on most days we put less than 2 parts per million into the river. No, wait, listen to me for a minute. We both know that no drinking water comes out of this part of the river, don't we? And in 2 kilometers, the river goes out into the sea. So why is it dangerous? Nobody is ever going to drink it, John. We don't need to build these new machines. John thought of his children, sailing on the river in their boat. He thought of the seals and people fishing, and little children playing on the beach and swimming. "We've got to build them," he said. David Wilson looked at him carefully. His voice when he spoke was very quiet and hard. "Listen to me, John. You're a very good scientist, and we're lucky to have you in this company. But you're not a businessman, and I am. Look at this." He picked up a sheet of paper and held it across the table for John to see. It showed how much money the company had. "We borrowed £10 million last year, and we employed 400 more people. Think how much that means to a small town like this." "I know," said John. "But just a minute. Listen to me. If we build these cleaning machines of yours, people will lose their jobs. A lot of people. This company can't afford to borrow any more money, John. We just can't do it." John stood up. "And what happens if people get ill because of this? Have you thought of that? What will the newspapers say then?" "No one will get ill, because no one drinks that water, John. The newspapers will never know about it." "They will if I tell them." There was a long silence. Then David Wilson stood up. He walked past John Duncan, without looking at him, and sat down behind his desk. When he looked up, his were cold and gray, like stones from the beach. "If you do that, John, I shall say you're a liar. You'll lose your job. You'll have to sell your house and go back to living in a nasty little flat. You'll never get another job, and you'll never have a house or any money again. You'll past be an old man, walking the streets without friends or money. Is that what you want?" John didn't answer. He stood for a long time and started at David Wilson and didn't say a word. After nearly 2 minutes, Wilson smiled, a thin, quiet smile. "But if you stay with us, you will be paid twice as much year. And no one will ever be hurt, because no one will ever drink that water." He got up from his desk, came round to the front, and in it out his hand. John stood still for a long moment. Then he shook hands. "Think about it, John," said David Wilson. John Duncan turned and walked slowly towards the door. Chapter 7. Christine and Simon Mary talked to Mr. Wilson too, but it was no good. She came out looking tired and very sad. For many months she argued with David Wilson about the danger of the waste products, but he would not listen to her. And so, 18 months after John's report, Mary decided to move to another company. She was pleased, because it was a more important job, but that wasn't the reason she was going. She knew that the cleaning machines would never be built. John was sad to see her go. He had enjoyed working with her, and she had come to his house several times over the last 1.5 years. His children liked her now. They had never been so friendly with any woman since their mother had died. On her last day, Mary and John had lunch in the factory restaurant together. "You don't have to go, you know, Mary," John said. "This company is very successful, and it's growing all the time. Your new paint has meant 400 new jobs, all because of your discovery. This isn't a poor town anymore. It's becoming successful, rich. People will want to move here from other places. He talked about the new sports center at Andrew's school, which was built with money from the paint company. There were 2 big new shops in the town as well, and a new theater, and a lot of new houses. "And it's all because of you," he said. "It's wonderful, Mary, don't you think?" He smiled at her across the table and took her hand in his. She looked at him quietly. He had changed a lot since he had first started working at the factory. For the first 6 months after he had got the job, he had been really happy and lively. She had always known where he was in the factory, because he was always laughing or singing to himself. But for the last 18 months, he had been much quieter. He was always busy, but he didn't sing or laugh, and he didn't often look Mary in the eyes. And when he was alone, he looked tired and sad. She took her hand away from his, gently. "You know why I'm going, John," she said. "I know what's going into the liver, and I don't like to think about it. You should leave too, and get a job in another company." "I'm too old." John stared at her angrily. "It isn't easy for me to get a new job. And Mary, the company has been making the paint for more than 2 years now, and no one's been hurt, have they?" Mary didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, "Only you." "What do you mean, only me?" She looked at him sadly. His head was bald now, and he was beginning to look like an old man. Once she had wanted to marry him. Now she was pleased that he hadn't asked her. "Oh, I just meant your leg, of course." John still had a painful red place on his leg, and sometimes he walked badly because of it. But that wasn't what Mary meant. John smiled. "My leg's nearly better. I'd almost forgotten about it. But Mary, before you go, I wonder if you could help me. It's a family matter." "I see. Well, how can I help? I don't know your children very well, you know." "No, of course not. But you're a woman and, well, it's sometimes difficult for me, as a father on my own. Christine's a young woman now, and she hasn't got a mother to discuss things with. I don't always know what to say." "No." Mary looked at him sadly. She often wondered why he didn't ask her to his house more often. She liked him and his children, and she thought he liked her. "How old is Christine now?" 18, and she wants to get married." "Already? She's rather young, isn't she?" John looked unhappy. "Well, that's what I say. But she had been so angry with me, Mary. Really angry." "Who's the young man?" "He's called Simon MacDonald. He's a journalist. He works for the local newspaper. He's a nice young man, I suppose. But every time I speak to him, we argue. And then Christine always agrees with him, and I get angry with her too. I don't want to, Mary, but I do. I feel I'm losing her, you see." "What do you argue about?" "Oh, I don't know. Stupid things, really. He belongs to one of these environmental groups, Green World, I think, and he's always talking about it. He thinks only young people are right, and everyone over 25 is always wrong." Mary looked at John thoughtfully. "Well, what do you want me to do, John? I'm not a mother and I've never been married." "No, but you could talk to Christine, perhaps, if Son came to our house for Sunday lunch." So Mary went to John's house. Simon was there, too. They had a meal and talked about horses and sailing. Everyone was polite, and there were no arguments. Later, Mary went with Christine to look at her horse, and Simon stayed with John. In the field, Mary began to talk about Simon. "He's a fine young man, Christine.